Imagine a man whose twisted idea of sport wasn't hunting animals, but humans. The vast wilderness of Alaska, a place known for its untouched beauty and unforgiving landscapes, became a deadly arena for this killer's sick game. Robert Hansen, a quiet baker by day, hid behind the mask of a family man. But out in the remote wilderness, he unleashed a nightmare beyond belief. This is not just the story of a serial killer, but a chilling tale of survival, terror, and a deadly predator who turned Alaska's breathtaking terrain into a graveyard for women. What makes this case truly horrifying? Hansen didn't just kill, he hunted. In the cold, isolated corners of Alaska, his victims ran for their lives, knowing full well that their pursuer was armed and experienced. The remote beauty of Alaska, once a symbol of freedom, became the last desperate hope for women who were hunted like animals in a deadly game they never agreed to play. Today, we unravel the story of Robert Hansen, a man who stalked his prey in ways that still haunt the streets of Anchorage to this day. Robert Hansen's early life was a twisted foundation that laid the groundwork for the horrors he would later unleash. Born in the small town of Esterville, Iowa, Hansen's childhood was marked by isolation and cruelty. His father, a strict disciplinarian of Danish descent, was a relentless perfectionist. Young Robert grew up under his father's oppressive shadow, often feeling like he could never live up to the man's high expectations. This harsh upbringing began to warp Hansen's sense of self early on. Hansen also suffered from severe acne, which left his face deeply scarred and made him the subject of constant bullying and ridicule at school. As if the acne wasn't enough, Hansen had a debilitating stutter, which made speaking in class or social situations a daily ordeal. It was this stutter that truly made him an outcast, preventing him from forming meaningful relationships with his peers, especially girls. He longed for acceptance, but all he found was rejection and humiliation. While other children found joy in friendships, Hansen retreated into himself, developing a deep hatred toward those who tormented him. His resentment grew over the years, particularly towards women. His fantasies of revenge and power began to take shape in these formative years, but no one could have imagined how dark those fantasies would become. It wasn't long before Hansen began channeling his frustrations into criminal behavior, setting the stage for the predator he would later become. His only escape from this harsh reality came in the form of hunting. Out in the woods, Hansen found solace and control, perfecting a skill that would later become his terrifying signature. Hunting gave him a sense of mastery that he couldn't find anywhere else, a dangerous precursor to the twisted sport he would one day play with human lives. In the early 1960s, Robert Hansen left behind his troubled life in Iowa, seeking a new beginning in the untamed frontier of Anchorage, Alaska. The rugged and isolated landscape seemed to offer him the perfect opportunity to reinvent himself. Upon arriving in Anchorage, Hansen carefully crafted a facade that concealed his dark inner world. To the locals, he was the picture of normalcy. Hansen became a well-known figure in the community after opening a small bakery in town. His unassuming presence, coupled with his friendly demeanor, earned him a reputation as a hard-working businessman. He was also a devoted husband and father, further solidifying his role as a typical member of the Anchorage society. However, beneath this ordinary exterior, Hansen's twisted fantasies were festering. His passion for hunting, which he had developed as a boy, grew even stronger in Alaska's vast wilderness. While he was known to locals as a skilled and competitive hunter of game, what they didn't know was that Hansen was slowly evolving from an ordinary man into a predator with a far more sinister hobby, hunting humans. In the cover of the quiet life he had built, Hansen's sadistic tendencies remained hidden from those around him. His growing obsession with power and control over women began to take shape, unnoticed in the backdrop of his carefully constructed life as a family man and local business owner. Little did anyone realize that Alaska, with all its beauty and isolation, would soon become the stage for one of the most horrifying killing sprees the state had ever seen. Long before Robert Hansen became known as the Butcher Baker, his criminal tendencies began to surface in his youth. Growing up in Iowa, Hansen's frustration with his appearance and social rejection led him down a dark path early on. By his teenage years, Hansen had already exhibited disturbing behavior. His first recorded offense came when he committed arson, burning down a school bus garage as an act of rebellion and anger. This crime landed him in prison, a brief stint that did little to curb his escalating criminal impulses. After his release, Hansen's criminal behavior continued, though he initially focused on smaller offenses like theft and shoplifting. His penchant for stealing became habitual as he began to develop a pattern of kleptomania. These petty crimes were early indicators of his need for control and power, behaviors that would later manifest in far more terrifying ways. By the early 1970s, Hansen's criminal activities took a much darker turn. He began to target women, specifically sex workers and dancers. His first known arrests came during this period when he was charged with the abduction and attempted rape of women. These encounters were far from isolated incidents. Hansen's behavior was escalating, but despite the seriousness of these crimes, he often managed to evade significant consequences. With the help of his clean-cut image as a baker and family man, Hansen crafted alibis that convinced law enforcement he was not a real threat. On multiple occasions, his lawyers arranged plea bargains or charges were dropped due to lack of sufficient evidence. In one particularly disturbing case, Hansen was arrested after abducting and attempting to rape a housewife, as well as raping a sex worker. He managed to avoid major punishment, serving only a brief stint in jail before being released back into society. His repeated brushes with the law sent a dangerous message to Hansen. He could continue to victimize women without facing serious consequences. Each time he escaped punishment, Hansen grew bolder, refining his methods and learning how to better cover his tracks. He became more selective with his victims, choosing those who were less likely to be reported missing or believed by the police. As he honed his ability to manipulate and evade justice, his fantasies of power and control deepened, leading him down the path toward becoming one of Alaska's most notorious serial killers. This period marked the transition from minor criminality to the full-scale horrors that would later be uncovered as Hansen transformed from a small-time offender into a predator with a deadly thirst for violence and domination. Robert Hansen's methods were as chilling as they were calculated, reflecting the sadistic fantasies he had harbored for years. His victims, typically sex workers and dancers, were women he believed no one would miss. Hansen carefully selected these women, knowing they were often vulnerable, transient, and unlikely to be searched for quickly if they disappeared. His approach was deeply predatory, and every step in his twisted process was designed to satisfy his need for power, control, and violence. Hansen would begin by luring his victims into his car, usually under the pretense of offering money for sexual services. His charm and unassuming demeanor, a soft-spoken baker with a wife and kids, disarmed many of these women. Once they were in his car, the nightmare began. Hansen would pull out a weapon, often a gun, immediately taking control of the situation. He would drive them to his home, where the horrors awaiting them were unimaginable. At his house, Hansen would chain his victims in his basement, where he would subject them to hours, sometimes days of rape and torture. He relished in their terror, feeding off the dominance he held over their lives. But this was only the beginning of his gruesome game. After tormenting his victims in his home, Hansen would take them out to the remote wilderness of Alaska, often flying them to his secluded cabin in the Nick River area via his private bush plane. The isolation of these locations meant that his victims were completely at his mercy, with no chance of escape or rescue. Once there, Hansen would release them into the dense wilderness, giving them a brief, cruel sense of hope that they might survive. But this was all part of his twisted fantasy. As the women ran for their lives through the thick Alaskan brush, Hansen would hunt them down, using the skills he had developed as an experienced hunter. Armed with a rifle and a hunting knife, Hansen would stalk his terrified victims, taking his time and savoring the chase. To him, they were no different than the wild game he hunted for sport. The hunt would only end when he decided it was over, when he had satisfied his perverse need to dominate and kill. For Hansen, the murder was just as important as the chase. He would often bury his victims in shallow graves, marking their locations with an X on an aviation map he kept as a trophy. These X marks would later serve as a macabre record of his killings, allowing investigators to find the burial sites of many of his victims. Hansen's ability to manipulate and control every aspect of the crime, his selection of isolated victims, his methodical use of fear and violence, and the final hunt in the wilderness made him one of the most terrifying serial killers of his time. His twisted game blurred the line between hunter and murderer, leaving behind a trail of bodies in the cold, unforgiving wilds of Alaska. This calculated methodology allowed him to evade capture for years, as the remote locations and the nature of his victims made it difficult for law enforcement to track him. Only after years of terror and the brave escape of one woman would the full extent of his horrors come to light. Robert Hansen's reign of terror left a devastating mark on Alaska, with at least 17 women confirmed dead at his hands. However, he is believed to have assaulted and raped many more. The exact number of victims may never be known, but investigators estimate that he may have killed as many as 20 to 30 women during his brutal spree. His victims were typically young women between their late teens and early 30s, often vulnerable due to their professions as sex workers or dancers. They were easy targets, women who, in Hansen's eyes, wouldn't be missed if they vanished. One of Hansen's earliest known victims is referred to as Aklutna Ani. In 1980, her remains were found by workers near Aklutner Road, close to Anchorage. She remains unidentified to this day, and her body was so decomposed that little could be determined about her background. Hansen later confessed to killing her, but provided few details about her life or even her name. Investigators believe she was one of his first murder victims, the beginning of a horrific string of killings that would last for years. The next confirmed victim, Joanna Messina, was a local woman who disappeared in 1980. Her body was found in a gravel pit near Seward, another isolated location far from any help. Joanna, unlike some of Hansen's other victims, wasn't involved in sex work, making her a unique case. However, her life still ended tragically as Hansen buried her in the wilderness just like so many of his other victims. Then there was Sherry Morrow, whose remains were discovered in 1982 near the Nick River, a favored dumping ground for Hansen. Sherry had been a dancer in Anchorage and had been reported missing a year before her body was found. Investigators noted that she had been shot multiple times, a hallmark of Hansen's cruel method of killing, where the victim was hunted like prey before being shot. Paula Gooding, another dancer, was discovered in 1983, buried in a similar shallow grave near Sherry Morrow's remains. Like many of his victims, Paula was lured with promises of money before being abducted, tortured, and eventually killed. Hansen's ability to carefully select his victims, ensuring that they were often transient or marginalized women, allowed him to go unnoticed for so long. The women who crossed his path were often young, vulnerable, and in desperate situations. This made it difficult for law enforcement to connect the disappearances initially, as many of the women were not immediately reported missing. One of the reasons Hansen's crimes were so difficult to track was the sheer remoteness of the areas where he buried his victims. The vast Alaskan wilderness provided an almost perfect cover for his atrocities. Hansen would fly his victims out to these remote locations in his private plane, ensuring they had no way of escaping the brutal hunt that awaited them. It wasn't until 1983, when Cindy Paulson bravely escaped, that the full scope of his crimes began to come to light. While 17 victims have been confirmed, many investigators believe Hansen's true victim count could be much higher, considering the vastness of the areas he used as his personal killing grounds and the fact that many bodies may never be found. His map, marked with dozens of excess, revealed the extent of his sadistic spree, each mark a potential grave, a life cut short by a man who turned the wilderness into his personal hunting ground. These victims, many of whom remain unidentified, were not just casualties of a sadistic killer, but also of a system that overlooked their disappearances for far too long. One of the most tragic aspects of Robert Hansen's killing spree was the police's initial inaction, rooted in the belief that many of the missing women's cases were simply not worth investigating. The majority of Hansen's victims were sex workers, dancers, or women living transient lifestyles, often marginalized by society. This made them easy targets for Hansen, but also contributed to the dismissive attitude of law enforcement when these women vanished. Many of Hansen's victims were never formally reported missing. In some cases, their families were unaware of their exact whereabouts, as many of the women had left home to work in Anchorage's red light district or strip clubs, hoping to make money to survive. The nature of their work, combined with the transient lifestyle of many, meant that their disappearances didn't raise immediate red flags. Some women were estranged from their families, while others had moved to Alaska from other states, leaving few people to notice their absence. For those whose disappearances were reported, law enforcement often dismissed these cases due to the women's involvement in sex work. The assumption was that they had either moved on, left town, or didn't want to be found. This bias slowed down any meaningful investigation and delayed the connection between the missing women and Hansen's activities. Police were reluctant to devote significant resources to what they believed were voluntary disappearances of women working in high-risk professions. This attitude allowed Hansen to continue his killing spree virtually unchecked for over a decade. Additionally, the disjointed nature of early investigations in Alaska further hindered progress. Bodies began to surface in remote areas like the Nick River and Eklutner Road, but investigators had difficulty linking the murders. Without a centralized effort, local police and state troopers failed to see the larger pattern. It wasn't until the involvement of experienced investigators like Alaska State Trooper Glenn Floth and the FBI's Criminal Profiling Unit that the dots began to connect. By the time Hansen was finally caught, the full extent of how many lives had been lost was shocking. Hansen's ability to target victims who were overlooked by society enabled him to operate under the radar for so long. It was a deadly combination of these women being socially invisible and a flawed system that didn't prioritize their disappearances. This lack of urgency and initial indifference by the police contributed to the long delay in justice for many of Hansen's victims. It wasn't until a victim escaped and law enforcement took her seriously that they began to realize the nightmare that had been lurking in Anchorage for over a decade. As the years passed, the growing number of missing women in Anchorage began to raise suspicion. What started as isolated reports of disappearances soon became a troubling pattern. Most of the missing women were sex workers or dancers who operated in the city's red light district, a vulnerable population often ignored by the authorities. As more bodies began to surface in remote areas, the unease in Anchorage grew, and it became clear that something far more sinister was happening. Alaska State Trooper Glenn Floth was one of the first investigators to see the larger picture. Floth, along with a small group of dedicated law enforcement officers, began to realize that these disappearances were likely the work of a single predator. He noticed that many of the bodies were being discovered in similar locations, isolated wilderness areas far from Anchorage, with no clear signs of how the women had ended up there. The first breakthrough came when the body of an unidentified woman, later dubbed Eklutna Ani, was discovered near Eklutner Road in 1980. While authorities had no leads on her identity, the manner of her death raised red flags. Then, in the following years, more bodies surfaced, including Joanna Messina and Sherry Morrow, both found in shallow graves near the Nick River. The similarities between these murders, from the way the women were killed to where their bodies were discarded, suggested a pattern, one that was far from random. Floth began piecing together the evidence, leading him to believe that the same killer was responsible for the growing number of bodies being found in the Alaskan wilderness. This was not a case of women simply disappearing, this was murder, systematic and calculated. Working closely with local law enforcement, Floth initiated a deeper investigation, reviewing missing persons reports, questioning witnesses, and gathering every possible clue. As bodies continued to be discovered, it became clear that the killer was not just abducting women, but hunting them in the wilderness. The remoteness of the locations where bodies were found suggested that the killer was someone with knowledge of the area, possibly someone experienced with hunting. Flood's involvement in the case marked a turning point. He recognized that the murderer was not a random opportunist, but someone who meticulously planned his crimes, targeting women who lived on society's margins. With each new discovery, Flood became more convinced that they were dealing with a methodical serial killer, and the task force worked tirelessly to connect the dots between the missing women, the discovered bodies, and any leads that could point them toward the perpetrator. It was around this time that the FBI's involvement began to sharpen the investigation, particularly with the help of John Douglas, a criminal profiler. Douglas created a psychological profile of the suspect, predicting that he was likely an experienced hunter, lived locally, had low self-esteem, and possibly had a speech impediment. This profile would later prove to be eerily accurate, as it matched Hansen perfectly. Thanks to Flav's dogged persistence and methodical approach, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. It was only a matter of time before this dedicated team would close in on the man who had terrorized Anchorage for years. The investigation was gaining momentum, but it would take one brave survivor to finally crack the case wide open. Cindy Paulson's escape marked the moment when Robert Hansen's reign of terror began to collapse. At just 17, she found herself in a nightmare unlike anything she could have imagined. Hansen lured her with the promise of money, a common tactic he had used to trap so many others before her. Once inside his car, the atmosphere changed drastically. A gun was pulled, handcuffs were locked, and Cindy was driven not to a place of business, but straight into the hands of a monster. Taken to Hansen's suburban home, Cindy was subjected to hours of brutal assault. He chained her by the neck in his basement, treating her like a possession, an object of his twisted fantasies. But what made Hansen truly terrifying was what he planned to do next. After torturing her, he didn't just intend to kill her, he wanted to play a deadly game. Hansen loaded her back into his car, preparing to take her to Merrill Field, where his bush plane awaited. His plan? To fly Cindy out to the Alaskan wilderness, release her into the unforgiving terrain, and hunt her down like an animal. But fate wasn't on Hansen's side that day. As Hansen busied himself with his preparations, Cindy saw her chance. Despite the fear coursing through her veins, she acted. She bolted from the car, her hands still cuffed, and ran barefoot across the airfield. Desperation fueled her every step as she fled from her would-be killer. Hansen, realizing his victim was escaping, gave chase. But Cindy, fueled by sheer survival instinct, managed to flag down a passing truck. The driver, a local man named Robert Yount, immediately sensed something was wrong. He whisked her to safety, driving her to a nearby motel where she could call for help. Even then, Cindy's ordeal wasn't over. When the Anchorage police first heard her story, they were skeptical. Hansen was a well-liked local baker, a family man, and Cindy was a young sex worker. But she didn't back down. She provided precise details about Hansen's home, his plane, and even the blue sneakers she had left behind in his car as evidence. Cindy's brave escape didn't just save her life. It shattered the illusion Hansen had built over the years. Her testimony was the key that unlocked years of investigative dead ends and finally brought Robert Hansen's murderous spree into the light. Anchorage had its boogeyman, and it was Cindy Paulson who stood up and exposed him for the predator he truly was. Her courage not only saved herself, but ended the terror that had claimed the lives of so many others. Even after Cindy Paulson's daring escape, the Anchorage police were hesitant to take her testimony seriously. Cindy's background as a young sex worker, combined with Hansen's reputation as a respected local baker and family man, initially cast doubt on her claims. Hansen's calm demeanor, coupled with his status in the community, made it easy for him to deflect suspicion. He had built a strong alibi, supported by a close friend, John Henning, who vouched for him, stating that Hansen had been with him during the time of Cindy's abduction. This alibi, along with Hansen's own practiced innocence, convinced the police that Cindy's accusations might be nothing more than an attempt at extortion. Hansen claimed that Cindy was simply trying to get back at him because he had refused to pay her more money for her services. Given the cultural biases at the time where the word of a sex worker was often disregarded in favor of a respectable man's, law enforcement was initially content to dismiss the case. However, Cindy's testimony never wavered. She was insistent and provided detailed descriptions of Hansen's home, his basement where she had been chained, and his plane at Merrill Field. More crucially, Cindy had left behind a key piece of evidence, her sneakers, which were found in Hansen's car, corroborating her story. These seemingly small details became the foundation of her credibility, and it was this persistence that forced investigators to take a second look at Hansen. The breakthrough came when detectives began to compare Cindy's testimony to the ongoing investigation led by Alaska State Trooper Glenn Floth, who was already suspicious about the growing number of missing women in Anchorage. Floth connected the dots between Hansen's potential involvement and the bodies that had been found in remote areas, matching Hansen's hunting style to the evidence left at crime scenes. The testimony of Cindy Paulson was the missing piece of the puzzle that finally allowed the police to obtain a search warrant for Hansen's home, plane, and vehicles. When the police conducted their search, they found overwhelming evidence linking Hansen to the murders: jewelry belonging to missing women, firearms, and a detailed map of the Alaskan wilderness with X marks indicating where bodies were buried were all discovered in Hansen's possession. This physical evidence, combined with Cindy's account, shattered Hansen's alibi and exposed the terrifying truth. His friend's false alibi could no longer protect him. It was Cindy's courage, her refusal to be silenced, and her meticulous memory that helped bring down one of the most dangerous serial killers in Alaskan history. As the investigation into Robert Hansen intensified, Alaska State Trooper Glenn Floth reached out to the FBI for assistance in building a criminal profile. This is where Special Agent John Douglas, one of the pioneers of criminal profiling, came into the picture. Douglas, known for his keen ability to understand the psychology of serial killers, developed a profile that would eerily match Hansen. Based on the evidence at hand, particularly the remote locations where bodies had been found and the nature of the crimes, Douglas painted a chilling portrait of the man responsible. He predicted that the killer was an experienced hunter, someone who was familiar with the Alaskan wilderness and comfortable in rugged terrain. This individual would have low self-esteem, possibly due to physical or emotional scars from early childhood, and would likely have difficulty forming relationships with women. Douglas also suggested that the killer might have a speech impediment, specifically a stutter. The profile didn't stop there. Douglas believed that the killer would take trophies from his victims, small personal items such as jewelry that allowed him to relive the moment of his crimes. This habit of collecting trophies was a common trait among serial killers who were deeply driven by control and power, a need to extend the feeling of dominance even after the act was over. Moreover, Douglas concluded that the perpetrator likely led a double life, appearing to be a well adjusted member of society while harboring deep rooted fantasies of violence. When investigators compared Douglas's profile to Robert Hansen, they found an almost perfect match. Hansen was indeed an expert hunter, with numerous local awards and hunting records to his name. His hunting skills, honed over years of stalking wild game, were horrifyingly applied to his human victims. The wilderness surrounding Anchorage had become his personal playground, where he used the isolation to carry out his sadistic fantasies. In addition, Hansen's stutter was well known. Throughout his life, it had been a source of shame and humiliation, especially during his youth when he had been ridiculed by his peers. This speech impediment had left him socially awkward, particularly around women. Rejected and mocked for his appearance and mannerisms, Hansen's bitterness toward women deepened over time, fueling his desire for revenge and control. Douglas's prediction about the trophies also rang true. When the police searched Hansen's home, they found a collection of personal items belonging to his victims hidden away in his attic. These keepsakes were the physical remnants of his gruesome exploits, serving as souvenirs of his dominance over the women he had hunted and killed. Thanks to Douglas's profile, the investigation gained new clarity. The combination of his psychological insights and the mounting physical evidence against Hansen would soon lead to the final unraveling of one of Alaska's most notorious serial killers. Once Cindy Paulson's escape and testimony connected Robert Hansen to the series of missing women, Alaska State Trooper Glenn Floth and his team knew they needed hard evidence to link Hansen to the murders. Cindy's brave account of her abduction wasn't enough on its own to take Hansen down. What they needed was something physical, something undeniable. Armed with Cindy's detailed descriptions of Hansen's home and his aircraft, as well as the profile created by FBI Special Agent John Douglas, investigators secured a search warrant to comb through Hansen's property. This would be the breakthrough they had been working toward. On October 27, 1983, police executed the warrant and searched Hansen's home, vehicles, and plane. What they uncovered was the stuff of nightmares. Inside Hansen's attic, investigators found a collection of trophies, small items belonging to his victims. These included pieces of jewelry, necklaces, and other personal belongings that had once been worn by the women he had hunted and killed. These trophies matched the descriptions provided by families of the missing women, confirming that Hansen had taken them as souvenirs to relive his gruesome exploits. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the aviation map found tucked behind the headboard in Hansen's bedroom. The map was marked with dozens of X's, each one indicating a burial site in the remote Alaskan wilderness. The X marks aligned with the locations where bodies had already been discovered, and further investigation would later reveal additional graves at sites marked on the map. This piece of evidence, along with the recovered jewelry, was irrefutable proof that Hansen had been systematically murdering women and disposing of their bodies in the wilderness. In addition to the trophies and the map, police found a stash of firearms, including a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. This particular weapon was key, as shell casings matching it had been found at several crime scenes where bodies had been recovered. The rifle was a direct link between Hansen and the murders. These weapons, along with the personal belongings of the victims, painted a clear picture of Hansen's sadistic activities and left no room for him to continue denying his involvement. The search of his property marked the moment when Hansen's reign of terror came to a definitive end. The physical evidence collected was overwhelming and conclusive, and no amount of denial or alibis could save him. Investigators had finally uncovered the gruesome truth. Robert Hansen was the hunter who had turned Alaska's vast wilderness into a killing field. With overwhelming evidence mounting against him, Robert Hansen's double life as a family man and sadistic predator began to unravel. following the police's search of his home, plane, and vehicles, which uncovered damning evidence such as the map with X marks identifying burial sites, jewelry belonging to his victims, and the rifle used in the murders. Hansen was finally arrested. Initially, Hansen tried to maintain his innocence, sticking to his story that Cindy Paulson was trying to extort money from him. However, the sheer volume of evidence made it impossible for him to continue denying his involvement in the disappearances and murders. His map, with its grim markers of grave sites and the discovery of his victims' belongings, were irrefutable. As investigators presented Hansen with piece after piece of evidence, the walls began to close in. Realizing that he could no longer talk his way out of the situation, Hansen eventually confessed. His confession was both chilling and methodical, as he recounted the horrific details of how he had abducted, tortured, and hunted his victims in the wilderness. Hansen admitted to killing at least 17 women, though many investigators believe the real number could be much higher, possibly up to 30 women. The precise number remains uncertain, as Hansen was selective in his confession and may have taken the full extent of his crimes to the grave. Hansen claimed that his killing spree began in the early 70s, and his targets were usually vulnerable women sex workers and dancers whom he believed society wouldn't miss. His cold, calculated hunting method involved flying or driving his victims to remote areas, releasing them into the wilderness, and then stalking them like prey before shooting them. His confession painted a picture of a man who took pleasure in the ultimate control, finding satisfaction in not just killing his victims, but in giving them a false sense of hope before snuffing it out. Hansen's confession allowed authorities to locate additional graves marked on his map, though some X's on the map led to locations where no bodies were found, leaving many to wonder how many victims still remain undiscovered in the vast Alaskan wilderness. Although he confessed to 17 murders, the true number of women he killed remains a grim mystery. In exchange for his confession, Hansen negotiated a plea deal to avoid a lengthy public trial. Alaska did not have the death penalty, but Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. His life behind bars would be a far cry from the wild hunts that had once given him his twisted sense of power. He died in 2014, never having shown any remorse for his victims, taking with him the full truth of his murderous spree. Robert Hansen's sadistic games played out in one of the most brutal and unforgiving landscapes imaginable, the vast wilderness of Alaska. The remote and rugged terrain that surrounded Anchorage became his deadly hunting ground, where isolation allowed him to carry out his twisted fantasies undetected for years. These areas were miles from any signs of civilization, where thick forests, rivers, and mountains stretched endlessly. It was a place where cries for help would never be heard, and Hansen knew the land intimately, making it the perfect stage for his murderous hunts. Hansen often flew his victims in his private bush plane to remote regions near the Nick River or other parts of the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. This vast, wild expanse was difficult to access without a plane or boat, allowing Hansen total control. The area's isolation gave him the perfect cover to torment his victims without the fear of interruption or discovery. Once in these desolate locations, Hansen unleashed his prey into the wilderness. These women, already terrified and traumatized from the brutal assaults they had endured, were given a brief glimmer of hope and illusion that they might have a chance to survive. He would release them into the wild, forcing them to run for their lives through the dense Alaskan brush. But this was not a rescue, it was the beginning of a deadly game. Hansen, an expert hunter, would track them, savoring the hunt. Armed with a rifle or bow and arrow, he stalked his victims, prolonging their terror as they scrambled through the harsh terrain, hoping in vain to escape. The wilderness that served as Hansen's hunting ground was a deadly weapon in itself. The thick underbrush, freezing rivers, and harsh Alaskan weather made escape nearly impossible. Even without Hansen chasing them, the odds of survival in such an environment were slim. But Hansen didn't just rely on the wilderness to do the killing, he relished the chase. Like the game he had hunted all his life, his victims became targets, and Hansen took his time, savoring the power he held over them. In some cases, he shot them from a distance, much like a trophy hunter would with wild animals, leaving their bodies to be buried in shallow graves. Hansen's familiarity with the terrain, combined with his skill as a hunter, allowed him to control every aspect of these hunts. He knew the land like the back of his hand, often using it to corner or trap his victims, dragging out their suffering as long as possible. His methodical use of the wilderness made him nearly impossible to catch for over a decade, as the remote locations ensured that his crimes went undetected. It wasn't until the bodies began surfacing in the late 70s and early 80s that investigators realized there was a serial killer lurking in the Alaskan wilderness. The Nick River area, in particular, became one of the central locations tied to his murderous activities. The river's winding path through forests and valleys made it a perfect dumping ground, and the sheer remoteness of the area ensured that many of his victims were never found. Hansen's hunting ground was as cold and unforgiving as the man himself, a vast, wild expanse that swallowed his victims whole, leaving only traces of their tragic ends. When Robert Hansen was finally arrested, the evidence against him was so overwhelming that he had little choice but to negotiate a plea deal. Faced with undeniable proof ranging from jewelry belonging to his victims to the map with burial sites marked with X's, Hansen knew there was no escaping justice. His lawyers quickly moved to secure a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty, which was not available in Alaska at the time. In exchange for his full confession to the murders of 17 women, Hansen agreed to help law enforcement locate the bodies of the victims he had buried in the remote Alaskan wilderness. As part of the plea agreement, he was required to confess to all of the crimes in detail, providing investigators with critical information that allowed them to recover many of the women's remains. Hansen's trial did not proceed in the typical sense, as the plea deal meant that he would avoid the death penalty and a prolonged court battle. Instead, he was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence ensured that Hansen would spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to harm anyone else. Despite the severity of his crimes, Hansen sought to minimize the public's knowledge of his horrific acts. He made a specific request to be incarcerated outside of Alaska, fearful that his notoriety might lead to retribution from people who knew his victims. Hansen was particularly concerned about being held in a local facility where he could be easily recognized, so he asked that his case remain low profile. His attempts to reduce media attention were only partially successful, as the gruesome details of his crimes were too shocking to be ignored. Hansen's final years were spent in the custody of the Spring Creek Correctional Center, a high-security prison in Seward, Alaska. He lived out the remainder of his days in isolation, surrounded by the very desolation he had once used to torment and kill his victims. In a grim twist of fate, Hansen, once the hunter who had thrived in Alaska's wild expanse, was now confined to a cell with no view of the wilderness he had once ruled. He died in 2014, taking with him any remaining secrets about the true number of women he had killed. Alaska State Trooper Glenn Floth played an instrumental role in bringing Robert Hansen to justice. His dogged persistence and commitment to solving the case transformed a complex investigation into a coordinated effort that finally stopped Hansen's killing spree. At the time, bodies of young women had been turning up in remote areas near Anchorage, and many more had simply disappeared. While there were suspicions of a serial killer at work, no one had yet connected all the dots until Floth took charge. Floth's breakthrough came when he recognized that the string of disappearances and murders wasn't isolated. These cases were all tied to someone who had access to remote areas, was familiar with hunting techniques, and was deliberately targeting vulnerable women. Floth's methodical approach, alongside his growing collaboration with the FBI, brought much needed focus to an otherwise disjointed investigation. Working closely with FBI Special Agent John Douglas, Floth used criminal profiling to zero in on Hansen. The profile predicted that the killer would be an experienced hunter with low self-esteem, possibly stuttering, and would collect trophies from his victims. Hansen fit this profile perfectly. With Douglas's assistance, Floth was able to build a psychological understanding of the killer's motivations, which helped in securing a warrant to search Hansen's property. But it wasn't just the FBI that Floth collaborated with. He also coordinated with local law enforcement in Anchorage, assembling a dedicated task force to handle the growing list of missing women. Flood's leadership was crucial in making sure the investigation remained focused, despite the challenges of navigating through various police jurisdictions and the vast, unforgiving Alaskan terrain where Hansen had hidden his victims. Flood's relentless pursuit of the case, along with Cindy Paulson's escape and testimony, was the turning point that allowed investigators to finally obtain the evidence needed to arrest Hansen. When the task force executed the search warrants, they found the treasure trove of evidence that linked Hansen directly to the murders. The discovery of jewelry belonging to his victims and the map with the X marks indicating burial sites solidified the case. Flood's determination, his ability to connect the right resources, and his refusal to let the case grow cold were instrumental in ending Hansen's reign of terror. His efforts saved countless potential victims and ensured that Hansen would spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to harm anyone else. Alaska State Trooper Glenn Floth was instrumental in bringing Robert Hansen's horrific killing spree to an end. Floth was relentless in his pursuit of justice, meticulously piecing together the evidence that would eventually unravel Hansen's carefully maintained facade. Despite the overwhelming odds, Floth refused to dismiss the disappearances of vulnerable women in Anchorage as mere accidents or runaway cases. His dedication to the case began when bodies started surfacing in remote wilderness areas and his suspicion of a serial killer grew stronger. Flood's dogged investigation led him to work closely with the FBI, enlisting the help of Special Agent John Douglas, whose psychological profiling provided crucial insights into Hansen's behavior. Through interviews, painstaking research, and a deep dive into Hansen's background, Floth built a case strong enough to secure a search warrant for Hansen's property. His methodical approach, combined with his tenacity, was key to uncovering the physical evidence, jewelry, weapons, and a marked map that linked Hansen to the murders. Without Flood's determination, Hansen might have continued to evade justice. He led the task force that finally ended one of the darkest chapters in Alaska's history. His work stands as a testament to the power of persistent and focused investigation in the face of overwhelming darkness. While Robert Hansen's crimes shocked Alaska and the world, it's vital to remember the women whose lives were stolen by this predator. These women, most of whom were sex workers or dancers, were often living on society's margins. Their disappearances were tragically overlooked for years, with many assuming they had simply moved on, making it easier for Hansen to prey on them without drawing attention. This case shone a harsh light on how easily vulnerable women, particularly sex workers, could fall through the cracks of a system that failed to protect them. The legacy of Hansen's victims is a painful reminder of how important it is to take every missing person's case seriously, regardless of their background or lifestyle. These women were not forgotten thanks to the tireless work of investigators, but their deaths revealed the dangers faced by those whose lives are often devalued. The case sparked broader conversations about the need for better protection and investigation of crimes against women, especially those engaged in high-risk professions. When the details of Robert Hansen's crimes finally came to light, the Anchorage community and the rest of the world were stunned. For over a decade, Hansen had maintained the appearance of a mild-mannered baker, an unassuming family man, respected by his neighbors and customers alike. The revelation that this quiet man had been hunting women in the wilderness shocked not just the local community but the entire nation. The media coverage that followed his arrest was intense. News outlets scrambled to cover the grisly details of his crimes, and the story of Cindy Paulson's escape became a focal point in the narrative. The public struggled to reconcile the image of the polite, everyday baker with that of a cold blooded killer. Hansen's case sent shockwaves through Alaska, where people were forced to confront the reality that a monster had been hiding in plain sight. After his arrest, Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He was incarcerated at Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska. Though he had confessed to killing 17 women, there was little doubt that the true number of his victims could have been higher. Even in prison, Hansen never expressed true remorse for his crimes, maintaining a chilling detachment from the horrors he had inflicted on his victims. Hansen lived out his days in isolation, far removed from the wilderness that had once been his killing ground. He died in 2014, having served his time in the stark confines of prison, a fate that, for many, felt like an appropriate end for a man who had caused so much pain and suffering. Robert Hansen's case remains one of the most disturbing and haunting serial killer stories in American history. His ability to lead a double life, a quiet baker and devoted family man by day, a sadistic hunter by night, left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. Hansen's crimes were horrific, not just because of the number of lives he took, but because of the method in which he did so. He turned the Alaskan wilderness into his personal hunting ground, using his skills as an outdoorsman to torment his victims in their final moments. The case serves as a chilling reminder of the importance of vigilant law enforcement and thorough investigation. It also underscores the vital role criminal profiling and detailed detective work play in tracking down predators like Hansen. Investigators like Glenn Floth, along with the psychological insights provided by John Douglas, were essential in bringing Hansen's reign of terror to an end. But the true legacy of this case belongs to the women who lost their lives, each one a reminder that no one's disappearance should ever be ignored or dismissed. As we reflect on the horror of Hansen's crimes, we must also remember the importance of compassion, diligence, and justice for all victims, no matter who they are. If you found this story both compelling and disturbing, don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth true crime investigations. Share your thoughts in the comments, and remember, every victim deserves to be heard and every case deserves to be solved. Keep the conversation going, and let's continue to shine a light on the darker corners of justice. Stay vigilant, stay informed,